Welcome to Through the Trauma podcast. My name is Amber Larkins, published photographer, storytelling expert, visual artist, entrepreneur, speaker, and coach. This podcast was born from one question: how do I get inspiring stories of triumph out to the people who need to hear them the most? Come with me, enter my world, where lives are getting changed, heroes are getting developed, and greatness is being achieved. Hello and welcome to Through the Trauma podcast. I am Amber Larkins, your host, and today I have with me Miss Emily Cleghorn. And Emily is an amazing award-winning trauma recovery coach. She's also an author, podcaster, and inspirational speaker on a mission to support trauma-surviving mamas. These mamas are navigating their triggers and tantrums as they heal their childhood trauma in the midst of parenting. She is going to share with us her powerful story of how she has overcome her own trauma and how she is inspiring audiences and readers so that they too can enjoy peace and healing. So, Emily, thank you so much for being here. I'm so happy to have you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
I know we briefly talked. We didn't get into everything about your story, but definitely compelling story that has moved you to a compelling mission, which I always love to dig into that. Appreciate your courage and your strength to share, as well as your heart to just inspire others. So do you want to tell us anything about yourself, or you can just move right into your story?
Yeah, if anybody would have sat me down and told me that I would be where I am right now when I was 15, 20, 25, I would have laughed at you. I would have told you were out to lunch and I would have laughed at you. It wasn't until I became a mama myself just over 5 years ago that I understood the need and what I could do.
And this is what you could do to make a difference with other moms that are possibly suffering and struggling through these childhood traumas. Is that correct?
Yeah. So when I was in the midst of one of my darkest times, just after having my daughter 5 years ago, and I call it the trauma train. I was sideswiped by the trauma train. All of the repressed emotions that I spent much of my life before becoming a mom pushing down and running away from came at me full speed and demanded to be dealt with. I had a choice. I could listen to my fight or flight response and get the heck out of there because to my body it wasn't a safe situation, or I could stay and figure it out. And obviously, I chose to stay and figure it out. But in that moment, I also decided that if and when I got to the other side and the fog lifted, then I would reach my hand back and help out other mamas, because I know I'm not special enough to be the only mama who had a traumatic childhood and is now wanting to do better for her kids and break the cycle.
Do you think that this comes from postpartum? Some of this postpartum could bring this out in mamas.
Yeah, well, nobody really tells you that when you become a mom, any of the repressed traumas that you have in from your childhood come back, and kids, as adorable as they are can also be incredibly triggering, and situations come up on the daily where you're like, oh, that happened. And you kind of have like a flashback where your kid is screaming and you feel unheard or whatever is going on, and your body resorts to the response that you had as a child, and you have to kind of stop for a second and work through that.
Yeah, I can relate, and I'm positive that there's a lot of moms who can, because I truly believe that we all struggle on some level with trauma. no matter how big or small, if we're struggling with it, we're still struggling with it. And I can see
Mhm.
how children can sometimes bring out those certain triggers in you. And you actually you coach mothers who are struggling through this. Is that correct?
Yeah. That's where my heart is.
Hmm. Yeah. So tell us a little bit about that journey of like how I know you wanted to give back. What did that look like as far as when you realized I am kind of at that place in my life where I'm healthy enough and ready enough to move into this coaching where I can actually lend my hand out and help others?
So, my journey started about a month postpartum where I knew that I needed to find resources to help myself heal, and to navigate the minefield of emotion that I had to navigate from a childhood of abuse and parental abandonment and all of these things that happened. I discovered very quickly that I needed to build myself back up, pick up the pieces that were crushed in all of that trauma, glue myself back together. I did a lot of research. I was one of those mamas who was Pinteresting or Googling what the symptoms are for postpartum depression, what the symptoms are for postpartum anxiety, and I would look at the lists and I would say, "Well, it's not just that. It's more than that." It was not just my hormones playing games with me. It was something that I actually had to give attention to and work through. So, I did a lot of self-education, a lot of mindfulness work. I did a lot of education around how my trauma, my stress response impacted my physical health because they are interconnected as much as we tend not to connect them. They are connected. So I used a lot of natural supplementation to support my body and kind of control my stress response and bring it back down because after you've been used to your stress response being stuck in the on position for 25 plus years, it's hard to come off of that. It's like an addiction. So it's taken a lot of gentle work for me to work through the journey.
Yeah, and doing the work is, I think, the hard thing. I think the first step of any transformation is awareness. First, we have to be
Mhm.
aware that we have a problem that needs to be addressed or a problem that needs to be transformed. But once we realize that about ourselves, then it's the journey. It's the
Mhm.
journey through transformation, which sometimes is the hard thing because that's where the work takes place. So, can you talk to us a little bit about, you obviously have this awareness, stuff's going on. You started this journey of researching and finding out as much as you can about
Mhm.
these issues, and you find something even deeper. So you realize it's not just postpartum, it's something more than just postpartum. Can you talk to us a little bit about that journey of discovering and kind of digging into that childhood trauma, knowing that's the problem, and then also your journey of finding out how to correct that problem?
Yeah. So when my daughter was just a brand new, adorable little baby sitting in her bouncer seat looking up at me, I really struggled to see the line of where I stopped or where my biological mom stopped and where I began and where I stopped and my daughter started. So for me, it took me a while to understand that I have autonomy and I have power to make different choices. At the very beginning of my journey, I thought that I was doomed to create make the same path that and the choices that my biological mom made. And that is not true. And it took me a long time for me to recognize that I am my own person. I can make my own choices. I'm not doomed to recreate the past. And that was one of the things that I really struggled with at first. Mothers, like mother figures, were not necessarily safe for me. And so being referred to as a mother was hard for me because, in my experience, mother is someone who abandons, someone who hurts, someone who loves conditionally and not unconditionally. I didn't want to be any of those things. My kids tend to call me mama, and that's why I use the term mamahood instead of motherhood, because motherhood as a word was triggering for me. And so I found a workaround. It means the same thing, but it's just a little bit of a different word. So those were some of the big light bulb moments that I had. There are a bunch more. Like, believing in myself was something that I continue to work on. If you don't believe in your ability to change, your ability to create the life that you want, your ability to break out of the cycle of trauma, you're not going to get very far. You have to have that belief that you can do it, that you can move outside of what you know, what's been your life, even though in the moment you don't know how you're going to get there. You don't know what step to take, what order to take the steps. You're going to figure it out. So those were some of the huge light bulb moments that have really helped me to move from where I was just over 5 years ago to where I am now.
You're using the term my biological mother. Can you talk to us a little bit about your story as to this journey into motherhood from the past of having a mother that you said leaving you and not being there
Mhm.
for you?
My mom gave me to my paternal grandparents when I was 7, 6 and a half, 6, 7 months old, and she signed all of her parental rights away. She was in my life whenever it was convenient for her, whenever life circumstances allowed for it to be. My dad was also in and out of my life, and for the most part, I lived with my paternal grandparents on and off from the time I was an infant until I left for university. There were a few instances throughout my years growing up where I lived with my dad, because when I was a really little girl, I was really close with my dad. I was daddy's little girl. When my dad got married, he married my stepmother and she had a son. So I had a stepmother and a stepbrother. And I wanted to be with my daddy because we were really close at that point. I lived with them for about 18 months. During that time, I was abused physically, emotionally, mentally, sexually, all of the ways. I really believe that that was my fault. It wasn't. It had nothing to do with me. I was on the receiving end of some horrible things, but it had nothing to do with me as a person. So from there, I moved back to be with my grandparents. And then when I was in my teenage years, I dealt with a lot of depression, anxiety, feeling unseen, unheard, like I didn't matter, all of those types of things. My dad left the relationship he was in when I was a little girl, got into another relationship. I ended up having a half sister, and I wanted to be with my little sister because I wanted a little sister my entire life. And so I was finally getting my little sister. And I wanted to be with her. So I lived with my dad again for a time. It was not a good situation. Not the abuse that I endured as a little girl, but it was still not a good situation. So I moved back in with my grandparents and decided that I should probably stay because not being there was not a good choice. I've spent much of my adult life working through the events of my early childhood.
How many kids do you have?
Yeah. I have 2 kids. I have a little girl and a little boy.
Can you talk to me just a little bit about what that looks like as far as the things that you're doing for yourself that's
Mhm.
safeguarding you from or them from that disconnect?
Yeah, so for me, one of the things that has been incredibly important for me is reparenting myself and learning how to navigate all of the emotions that I've got going on. And then also teaching my kids how to navigate their emotions and how to communicate their emotions. About a year ago, my son was having temper tantrum after temper tantrum after temper tantrum. You know how toddlers get sometimes. They don't have the words to express themselves. And my son's preferred method of communication at that point was screaming. And he was screaming and screaming and screaming and screaming. I was trying to calm him down, and nothing was working. It had gotten to the point where my nervous system just couldn't handle any more screaming. And I got mad and screamed myself and kicked my laundry room wall. And immediately I knew, I felt better, but I knew that it wasn't the right response. I didn't want my son seeing mommy kick a hole in the laundry room wall and then take up the hobby himself. So that was my wake up call to, oh, so I am not as far in my healing. There are still some spots where I need to give some attention. So we really work in our family on communicating how you're feeling, using your words, breathing, because for a long time I held my breath. Only trauma survivor can really understand what that means. You're holding your breath, you're waiting for the other shoe to drop. Learning how to breathe through stressful situations where in previous experiences you might have shut down, you might have exploded, you might have responded in anger or whatever. Learning how to breathe through those and to identify how exactly I'm feeling. And then usually I journal things out. For me, writing is huge. I find writing safer than talking. Through that process, I'm able to make discoveries about what areas need some healing work much faster than if I were to just sit down and talk with a therapist, because I guard myself when I'm speaking with another person. But if I'm writing something down in a private journal, it'll flow through the pen and I won't even blink an eye. Well, I might after I read it back to myself, but
I think that's why journaling is so powerful. That is one of the, I think, one of the top things that we can do. That and in that journal being gratitude, like having gratitude and writing down the things we're thankful for. I've seen huge transformation in my own life from journaling and specifically journaling
Mhm.
things that I'm thankful for. But that idea of journaling, there is something powerful that, like you said, it moves through the pen. And I don't think
Mhm.
there's any better way to describe that. Have you used other, I would say, like modalities to bringing out that awareness or to helping work through those emotions?
Yeah, when I was first getting started on my healing journey, I was using some essential oils. I also like using different supplementation. So, one that I use quite regularly now is to support my adrenals, which um, get wore down if you're constantly stressed. So, working on supporting my physical body through supplementation and then using the essential oils to access the olfactory nerve has been helpful for me.
I know I've used essential oils and I think they are also very powerful that sometimes we forget to use them, I feel like. Have you done therapy yourself?
Done therapy throughout my life, and I've got some therapy trauma. So therapists just being really unprofessional and telling me to get over it. A lot of therapy in this time span of my life. It's something that I've considered, but for me, I think I would benefit more from another modality other than talk therapy.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm always curious to know what people's thoughts are on therapy. I personally believe that we all need therapy as humans.
Mhm.
Like we go through life and we carry these bags to us.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to have therapy. But I mean, I've heard other people, specifically on my show, come on and talk about the fact that they've had really bad therapists. And
Mhm.
I'm curious your thoughts about this because I'm starting to wonder if there's not a shift in the mental health treatment, specifically with
Mhm.
therapy, into like of a more of a coaching format. Because it seems to me like you have a therapist, though they've been clinically trained, but then you
Mhm.
have someone who's actually lived it, who's gone through it,
Mhm.
who's dealt with they can relate. There's a certain connection and relatability. What are your thoughts about that? Or do you think that's a substitute or something that you use complementary?
There are a lot of really great therapists out there that are great at what they do. However, I do not think it's appropriate for somebody who is not trauma informed or has experienced and overcome trauma themselves to be the therapist for a trauma survivor. Because you can assume all you want about how that person is feeling, and you can read all of the books about how like you can be book smart on trauma, and you can assume that you know how that trauma is going to play out in a person, but everybody's different and we're not books. I think there is a specific place for trauma therapists. I I don't think it's necessarily appropriate for somebody who has not experienced trauma, who is not trauma informed, to be the therapist of a trauma survivor,
Mhm.
because you can't possibly know what
Mhm.
somebody
And
else is experiencing.
yeah, unless you've been through it. And
Yeah.
this is why I'm wondering if there's more, like a little bit more of a shift in the direction of, coaching. Online coaching has gone through the roof over the last several years. And I think it's
Oh,
just a
yeah, it has.
continuing to growing as an industry. But I think what we are seeing is the authenticity and the people, like you said, that are trauma informed. They come out of something and they truly want to provide help and
Mhm.
use that turn that trauma into triumph. I'm always trying to look for ways to, people that come and listen to my show, I always want them to take away, like if they've gone through that type of trauma, to be connected with the people that have
Mhm.
actually gone through that trauma and can offer resources and ideas and tips and ways that they've overcome, because like you said, the brain is a very complex thing and humans are very
Mhm.
complex people. So we
Yeah.
have to figure out what works for us, and it's very unfortunate that people want to get help and they look for the right therapist, and then like you said, they get into a therapy that is not beneficial and somewhat even causes more of an issue. um
Mhm.
but I also tell people this: I don't think that, it's like, I heard this analogy where, when we start dating, we date one person, and if that goes bad and you get like bad experience from that particular person, it doesn't mean you don't go back and date again until you find the person.
Yeah.
So I know there's like mixed feelings about that. And I do think that people do have to find what modality or what system works for them. But I do think
Yeah,
finding someone who can relate is super important.
it's crucial.
Mm. Yeah, for sure. So, how old are your kids now?
Uh, 5 and 3.5.
Okay. Okay. So, still little, and at that age,
Mm-hmm.
they're still kind of bouncing off the walls. At least that was my experience with motherhood. Um, but do you help moms that have any age children, or do you find that majority of the moms that you help have the smaller kids and still kind of have that element of postpartum and triggering from being a new mom?
I tend to help mamas who are early in their early in their journey, figuring out
Mhm.
how to navigate their journey, figuring out that they can create the life that they want for their little ones and kind of hold their hand as they walk through it, creating a community of support because those early years when your kids are like completely dependent on you for their survival, those are really hard years. And I think I've heard a lot of people say that parenting is hard in different ways through all the different phases. But if you can get a good foundation, then maybe it doesn't have to be so challenging in the later years.
I agree with you. And I read something when my little ones were smaller. I read something that was talking about how their brain develops more in the
Mhm.
first 7 years from conception until those first 7 years of their lives. And you have to think if we can catch them when they're young, between
Mhm.
that first and seventh year, that
Mhm.
we can offer them tools that is going to help them throughout their life. So I think there's a lot of truth in what you just said. The challenge is holding yourself together and navigating becoming a
Mhm.
mom to it. You go from having a very quiet, peaceful life, and then you have a baby, and then sleepless nights, and then it's chaos.
Yeah.
My son was my first, and he was chaos. I mean, he was like bouncing off the walls every day, and I'm like, I have no energy. I should have had him when I was 20, and I still had a lot of energy to give. But it's hard. It's really hard to navigate that. And then if you go through any life circumstances, so we live in a
Mhm.
culture where divorce is prevalent, where we're working through a lot of times people wait till they're a little older to have children, and they may be
Mhm.
dealing with the grief of losing a parent or family. But anytime other things are kind of come up to the parent, then we have that coupled with, okay, now I'm dealing with this, taking care of myself, and also trying to raise my child, which is difficult. Do you
It's a
work
lot.
with those types of issues as well?
I am certified as a health coach and a life coach. My focus, my heart is to work with trauma survivors. So whether you are early on in your journey and you're building your foundation, trying to navigate through those postpartum years, or you've got teenagers that are giving you grief, or you're navigating midlife and life is just a lot. I can help you navigate and give you the guiding questions to help you figure out what step is best for you.
Are these questions that you would have your clients ask themselves, or questions that they should be
Yeah,
asking
it's
other people around them?
they're questions I ask my client and my client works through on a personal level because if you're not if you're not happy with something in your life, working on it within yourself is going to create ripples within your family, and positive things. When you start seeing positive change for yourself, positive change will start happening in your family. It may take a little while for it to ripple, but it will come.
Can you give us a baseline of like what you would recommend someone, like say someone come to you and said, I'm really struggling in this area. What would be your steps that you would recommend for them to find the help they need and then get the help that they need?
Well, I always start with my clients to get them to acknowledge where they are, what they want, and what's holding them back. So if you can acknowledge where you're at currently, what is the source of your struggle? Where do you want to be instead? And what's important about having that? What will you get when you achieve X? What will be the result? How will you know that you have it and what will be the result? And then what's keeping you from getting there? And then I work with my clients on helping them to overcome those obstacles that are holding them back and helping them see what they can achieve.
That's where kind of the rubber meets the road because
Mm-hmm.
once someone has an awareness that there's an issue, then they find the path, the journey, the
Yeah.
the correct way that they're going to walk to get the help to do the things they need to do to grow as a person and to heal. And then being that person, embodying that person that is healed. And then the next step I think is reaching back out and helping others that are going through the kind of the same thing. And I think if people can embrace those things, they find true healing.
Yeah, I would agree.
Tell us a little bit about where someone could find you if they wanted to reach out and learn more about what you do, or if they're specifically a mother who's struggling, um, where would they find you at?
If you want to learn more about what I do, you can find me on the Mamahood After Trauma podcast. That's my podcast. I put episodes out every week. Each week is a different topic. I have guests on there, and you can also find me on Instagram. If my my inbox is always open, so you can find me there at Emily.Cleghorn, CLEG horn.coach. So yeah, my inbox is always open. You can reach out to me if you are struggling and need someone to talk to. I'm here for you, friend.
And you have a book. You've written a book.
Yes, I do.
And who is that for? Who would you recommend?
So I wrote that book for trauma surviving mamas, and it is like an action plan of the steps that I personally took, the learning that I did. I put it all in a book. I organized it, and then on top of that, I also created a workbook so that you can work through it and, not just read the book and never do anything with the information. Do the workbook and see transformation for yourself.
So that's awesome. There's several ways there to get in contact with Emily if you want to learn more. Very specific niche audience that you have, and so needed because I have interviewed another several episodes ago a mama that had gone through postpartum, and this is way more than what we realize that moms
Mm-hmm.
go through. And it's something that I feel like is not talked about on a large scale. And what you're doing is even slightly more. That's actually going back through and dealing with the trauma. And I was just meditating on this morning with trauma specifically, but how you can put a band aid on trauma
Mm-hmm.
and ignore it. And I feel like that's what a lot of people do, have to dig back into that trauma and release it or get rid of it, or
Mhm.
at least learn how to manage it. And if you can't do that,
Yeah.
it's going to be really difficult to heal.
Yeah, it's gonna run
Yeah.
your life.
Um,
And you're not
so,
even gonna realize it.
right. Because those triggers pop up out of nowhere. You can be
Mhm.
living your life, going about your day, and all of a sudden, oh, I'm reacting to something, and it's rooted in a trigger. It's awesome what you're doing. I always have an appreciation for people. I know I'm an empath, and it's really hard for me sometimes to dig into trauma, but I feel like it's a much needed thing. You doing what you do, it's powerful. And so I appreciate what you're doing. And all of those things that you said, that will be in the show notes as well, so that people can get in easy contact with you and have links to get to your book and all of those amazing things. But with that being said, do you have any closing thoughts or any recommendations that you would leave us with at the end here?
Well, I think so often in motherhood, but especially as trauma surviving mamas, we feel like we're the only ones walking this path. And so I just want to offer a word of encouragement that if you are a survivor of childhood trauma and you are struggling in your mamahood, you're not alone, mama. Um, find a community of people who get you. Don't go to someone who hasn't experienced trauma and expect them to know how to help you. It's like taking your car to McDonald's for an oil change. They wouldn't know what to do. They wouldn't know how to support you. So find a community of trauma survivors who are focused on healing. Finding a community of trauma survivors who are just commiserating isn't going to help you. But find a community of trauma survivors who are looking to heal, and I think you'll find that you feel less alone. In fact, I know that you'll feel less alone, and you'll feel more inspired to keep going even on those days where it feels impossible.
Such great advice. And the community aspect is huge. You have to get around people that understand you, because it is a sometimes trauma can be a very lonely place, and if we
Mhm.
feel like no one gets us, it or we're the only one going through that, it can feel very lonely. So I would encourage that highly, to find your people and people that get you and can support you and love you through it. And maybe they don't fully understand it, but they at least can empathize with you about it.
Mhm.
Emily, thank you so much for coming here today, for sharing your expertise, and just for the work that you do. It's truly appreciated.
Well, thank you so much for giving me space to share. I really appreciate that.
Thank you for listening to Through the Trauma podcast. If you have found value in this episode or believe in the mission behind what we are doing, please subscribe so that you never miss any future episodes. Also, be sure to check out our transformation project at transformationthroughtraumaproject.com, where we help inspirational stories get heard on a larger scale through multiple platforms. If you know someone who can benefit from this episode, please share it with them. Until next time.